Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. Looks like we have a bunch of folks joining us live, which is amazing. Awesome. We'll just give everyone a couple minutes to jump on here. Honestly, there's like nothing more satisfying than seeing that number like creep up and like right at go time.
Yeah, we've got 117 folks live. We had almost 1,000 folks register.
Unreal.
Thanks everyone for coming and being here.
Hey Rahul, thanks for joining us. I'm curious, for those hopping into our book launch with Sam today, where is everyone joining from? Feel free to drop it into the chat. Rahul's India. Oh, folks are saying the chat is disabled.
Ew.
With Sweden. Do you want to turn on the chat, Sam?
I will try to turn on the chat. I am not sure I am going to be able to do that. Okay, I'll try. Let's see what we can do here.
Thanks for pointing that out, folks.
Yeah. This is both of our first times doing the webinar as a host rather than a panel. So apologies for any technical difficulties we may be encountering along the way. Thank you for bearing with us, everybody. No, I don't see how I would do that, unfortunately. If anyone has, okay. So I guess we can just use the Q&A as a chat then. Folks, if you're chatting, if you have something to say, just I guess drop it in the Q&A, and
Awesome.
we can use the Q&A as a chat. So.
Amazing. And I'll ask those questions to Sam as well. So anytime during our conversation here today, if you have any questions for Sam that you'd like me to ask, feel free to just pop them into the Q&A section. I'll be sure to raise them to him.
Okay. Okay. So thanks everyone.
How many folks do we have? Okay, we have around 164. Okay, it's slowly climbing up. Sam, I think we can start. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm your host, Neha Varshneya, and I am the Director of Product Marketing here at Gatsby, which is the leading framework for the modular web. And today with us on the hot seat, I have our very own co-founder and Chief Strategy Officer, Sam Bhagwat, aka the author of the new book, Modular, the Web's New Architecture, and How It's Changing Online Business. So, Sam, first off, I think a huge congratulations is in order. How do you feel about finally having your book out there for the world to read?
Feeling great. I mean, I've been working on this for about a year, and the story. It's great that it finally all came together, and now it's kind of in everybody's hands to kind of use it in your organizations to create change.
That's awesome. And Sam, I know you started Gatsby about what? I think it's been like 5 years. So, what led you to write a book now?
I think some things you only really realize along the way as
Yeah.
Kyle and I started Gatsby as a company back in 2017, but just there's been this kind of critical mass of conversations over the last year, and we really realized the book has a lot of different threads in it: design, web development, content management, and analytics, web performance, and sort of like the cloud architecture. And it took a while for us to realize that like these are the threads that are sort of like all weaving together.
Yeah. Makes sense. And I know I have a copy of the book here with me right now, and I've been kind of flipping through it. And the table of contents, wow, you cover a lot in here. Are there some chapters in particular that you wanted to highlight to those tuning in?
Yeah, it might be a good sort of like just launching point in terms of the story of what's going on here. So it just sort of starts with the last generation of web technology, the monolithic CMS, which is the standard way of kind of building in the 2010s, and then the sort of the emergence of a lot of the different pieces of the puzzle, whether the cloud services like Contentful and Algolia and Auth0, the React, the Jamstack, so on, and then how they kind of cohered together into like an architecture, and then which I sort of called the modular web solar system, and then how you implement that, the different types of stories we see around companies implementing it inside their organizations, the different types of people we see that have tended to drive change, as well as the different types of organizational stories that are playing out. And then kind of finally, the last chapter is kind of what's next for the whole ecosystem, really. And take my hand at prognosticating, which who knows how well that'll go. I guess we'll see in a few years, but.
That's awesome. Thanks for covering that high-level summary. Love it. Sam, okay, there's been something that's been keeping me up, and that's during one of our last meetings together, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I heard you throw around the phrase of like, oh, I think the modular web is sort of like the Avengers. Is that correct? Did I hear that right? And if so, I am intrigued. Please dive into what you meant by this.
Yeah, the modular architecture is the story of a lot of different tools kind of coming together to create a technology stack that is like a great foundation for a medium-sized, a large, a small company, any kind of company. And the Avengers is a story of these sort of like flawed individuals that may have but that have great powers, but sort of like may have some drawbacks too. I don't know, Iron Man has maybe a bit of a control problem, maybe a bit of a temper, however you want to describe that. And I think Bruce Banner is maybe a little bit overreactive to situations, could calm down maybe a little bit, but you kind of put them together, and their strengths together, and they kind of together make this great team that can sort of like make worldwide change, or handle sort of global problems. And I think there's something, there's some analogy there in that the sum is greater than the whole. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
That's awesome. I love that you've used that analogy, because I'm a marketer. That made a lot of sense to me. So thank you for explaining it in such a way. So speaking of being a marketer, I work with a lot of developers pretty much on a daily basis. And I know you and I have had one-on-one conversations about how to kind of further strengthen that alignment between both functions. But I think that's something that would be very beneficial if we could share that out with everyone kind of tuning in right now about things that we've done at Gatsby to better align marketing and development teams.
Yeah, I mean, and I think sort of like the first thing I'd say is, like, broadly speaking, this is kind of like why I wrote the book, is that there's a lot of marketers and developers have two different sort of like skill sets and knowledge bases, and often if there isn't kind of a cross correlation between what's in each head, there may be conflict instead of sort of like working together. And that again, that's kind of like one of the reasons I wrote this book. If you sort of like feel like the teams are a little bit at loggerheads, or you're trying to figure out how to move into the future together, and like maybe one is more excited about it than the other one. But specifically, I think like what we've seen with Gatsby, as well as like some companies that have been using Gatsby and Contentful or like other headless CMSs, and sort of like transitioning into the future, is that it comes down to sort of like, some of it is about team structure, some of it is about communication. So team structure wise, some of the most sort of successful transitions we've seen have been led by a developer or two that sort of embedded themselves inside a marketing team, and really just had daily communication. And obviously sometimes that isn't quite possible because there's more developers, or like there's more marketers, or whatever. But then we see it coming down to use like regular team meetings between the teams, and regular one-on-one communication and collaboration between a lot of individuals. Websites are one of the most cross-functional projects really in any organization. And so like there's two ways of reacting to that. One is like, oh my gosh, I have to like interact with people and all these other functions like all the time. This is so frustrating. The other one is to just kind of embrace it and say like, okay, cool. Like what the reason websites are so cross-functional is because, they just drive a lot of business impact, and say like, let's embrace it. Like, let's figure out, given that that is the case, how do we sort of like, how do I use my knowledge and leverage my knowledge and sort of share that and collaborate well with others, and move towards the future together.
100%. And I think like sometimes it's like the most, I guess, obvious steps that one can take that we sometimes overlook. And for us, I know that was just having a meeting with marketers both present and developers versus us trying to play like a game of telephone and be like, oh, the product team told us this or the leadership team told us this. It's like, no, why don't we just have a meeting with both parties as stakeholders, and so we can both get aligned and kind of hear from each other versus hear from other folks within the organization. So folks, keep it simple. Sometimes all it takes is having that weekly meeting with both parties present. So thank you for touching on that, Sam. Sam, I know in your book, you also talk a lot about content workflows, but I think what I'm curious to learn more about is how do you see, like, there's a lot of talk about analytics these days. So how do you see analytics in particular fitting into this modular structure? And what exactly do developers need to know about this?
Yeah, so I think the first thing maybe it makes us to kind of just touch on what is kind of the, I use it in the title, but like what exactly is the modular structure in the first place? And so there's a chapter 8 that's called the web technology solar system, which is basically, I'll kind of show the diagram here kind of briefly. But so the analogy is sort of, a federated architecture, as developers might put it, or like the sort of maybe more organizationally friendly term would be like a solar system where you have planets and you sort of have moons around each planet, right? So you might have your headless CMS, and then you might have some content workflows and internationalization and approval stuff around your headless CMS. You might have your build and deploy hosting platform, your Gatsby cloud, and then you might have Gatsby as a framework. You might have, as a Jamstack framework, you might have React, you might have your React components, you might have Storybook to organize those components, and a number of kind of like other different tools, and they're all sort of like orbiting your build and deploy platform. And then similarly kind of for e-commerce systems, for companies that have that, there's a number of different systems, whether that be like reviews or subscriptions, blah 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 blah. Then kind of like similar, and like for analytics, then particularly, what we see is that there's a wide variety. There's a wide variety of different tools that have sort of emerged with the over the last decade, and they're very helpful for marketing teams in understanding like users and visitors, and often marketing teams want to use a lot of them together. But the challenge from a sort of like a website perspective can be that that's a lot of different sources of data, and so we see teams turning to a tool like Segment or a tool like RudderStack that kind of orchestrates this data together. And in addition, what it kind of does is it actually makes the performance better as well, which is kind of like great from a sort of a developer point of view as well. So I think modular web solar system, moons, planets, moons, and then specifically that's kind of how the analytics puzzle fits into the overall story.
I love it. We're talking about Avengers. We're talking about the solar system. This is great. Sam, okay, I want to jump into the audience's Q&A pretty shortly. I see we have a lot of great questions, so keep those coming. But before we dive into those, Sam, would love to learn from you. Who were you keeping in mind when you were writing this book?
Yeah, so I think that I guess maybe I'll give a little bit of the backstory of sort of like a little bit of sort of how how the book came to be, and then I think that'll lead nicely into that. So, I found sort of like personally, as well as I think other folks in customer success and sales, like our product folks, we're having a lot of the same kinds of conversations with users of Gatsby. And people who are just intrigued by headless and modular architecture in general. And the way that conversations sort of worked was that, someone would be familiar with maybe one or two or the threads, like there were, maybe there were developers that are like really familiar with the Jamstack framework piece and the React piece, and like a little bit familiar with the headless CMS piece, but like not very familiar with like maybe web performance, or maybe not very familiar with sort of the design trends, or not very familiar with the analytics piece of the puzzle. And so a lot of the times the conversations, because they'd kind of be coming to us like, hey, how should we architect these systems together? And so our answer was kind of like, okay, like let me understand how you've put it together, how you understand the different pieces, and then we'd sort of, as soon as we kind of try to walk through some of the pieces that the other person may be like a little bit less familiar with, and then once we got there, then we could sort of like have something useful to say about the architecture of the system. And so the reason that writing a book made sense is I just, again, wanted to bring all of these threads and sort of like weave them together into like a single kind of piece, so it was just clear. So it was clear what you should do, no matter sort of like where you started in the puzzle, whether you're a developer, whether you're a marketer, whether you're a designer, whether you like, if you're a marketer, if you're in content or demand gen. And so in that way, like I really wrote this book for organizations that are trying to move towards the modular web. And, again, websites are one of the most cross-functional projects in any organization. And so moving together often requires a lot of alignment and consensus. We encourage folks to, do proof of concepts and like work on small projects if they're trying to build consensus, and if consensus is the barrier to adoption, like okay, like build a proof of concept, build a smaller project, like definitely encourage them to do that. But we also wanted to provide sort of the narrative, and the story of like how you do this in just a really crisp and kind of clean way.
Love it. Sam, I know you've totally sold me, but for those tuning in, how can they get their hands on a copy of a physical book of yours?
Yeah, so we'll drop a link, I guess maybe not in the chat, but we'll drop it in the Q&A. Everyone that sort of like is here now live, we're going to drop a link to a Google form, and you can fill out the Google form with your information to mailing address and such, and then then we'll send it to you over the next couple of weeks. And then in addition, it's also live on Amazon. So we'll drop that link in the chat as well.
Okay, awesome. So Sam, did you want to drop that into the Q&A section right now, just so folks have it? Because I know once I start going through the Q&A, I know we're going to get more questions. So why don't you drop in the link to the Google form in there? And just for everyone kind of watching right now, so we will be mailing out physical copies if you're in North America / Europe, but for any other regions, like please leave your email address and we'll get you an ebook ASAP as well.
Yeah, and it looks like I'm not able to type it as a question, so I'm going to type it as an answer to Ian's question. I'm going to type it as an answer to Ian's question. Thanks everybody for dealing with our improv here. So Google form, and I'm typing it in here. Type answer. Okay. What is this? No, okay. Oh, here we go. Send. Okay. Apparently. Okay. Okay. So it's now in the answered questions. If you look in the answered questions, that is the Google form, and then I will also drop the Amazon. Again, thank you everybody for bearing with us with and then I'll answer Sujit's question. Also with the Amazon link, so you can see it in the answered part of the Q&A. Great. Okay. So.
Okay. Awesome. Do you want to jump into answering some questions now?
Yeah. And so for folks, I see folks. I see folks dropping in emails and stuff. You should drop it in and answer into the form. Are people able to see the answered questions, or are they not able to see the answered questions? I guess I could also try. Can folks see the chat if I send them the chat? I'm sending that, and then I'll send the. send this as well in the chat. Yeah, I guess yes. Okay, people can see. Yeah,
I
okay.
feel like the chat should be working now. Okay, thank God, finally we figured it out.
Yeah, okay, cool.
Okay, amazing, sweet. Sam, okay, let's jump into the questions. We have a lot here. Perfect. Okay, why don't I just kind of scroll up to the top and take it from there? Okay, we have a great question coming in from Steve Jackson. Steve mentions, so you mentioned Segment. Do you have any other deployments of analytics tools that can be quickly implemented with Gatsby? I.e., I know Google Analytics, but are there any others?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a number, and it really with analytics, it depends on what you want to do with analytics. So I'm going to drop a we have a good doc on this. So I'm going to just kind of quickly look it up, and I'm going to drop the link in the doc while I sort of respond. But the quick answer is that it really depends on what you want to do with analytics. So Google Analytics is a great sort of basic analytics tool for figuring out how many page views you have on different pages. If you want something that gives you a lot more like cohort analysis or does segmentation, we often look at something like Heap. We see people using for like screen recording. If you want to see individual people's experiences, people using something like Full Story. Then we see larger companies that are trying to orchestrate a number of different tools. That's when you kind of start looking to something like Segment. And like the companies that look to Segment are often using it as like an alternative to using like Google Tag Manager, which does some of the same things, but there's a sort of significant performance hit often that folks have if they're just sort of like dumping a lot of different analytics tools in Google Tag Manager.
Awesome. We have another question here from Jim. What things content and marketing teams can do today to prepare for a transition to headless tomorrow? Ooh, great question. Skills that should be learned, processes and ways of thinking about content that should be adjusted.
Yeah, gosh, that is a really good one. So there's a number of things. I think one is to think about content as so I guess first off, the question is the question is about content, but I think it's equally true for different types of teams, for developers, as well. But I'll start with content because that's what the question kind of asks about content. And so for content, one of the big things is to be thinking about content as reusable and not just living on a sort of like single page at a single location, but like thinking about, well, what is the content architecture of your site? And a lot of headless CMS vendors, when they're working with sort of like larger companies, they'll sort of sit down in the beginning of the implementation, and they'll do kind of a whiteboarding session, and they'll sort of like whiteboard out like what your content schema should be like. And so whether or not you're sort of like, you're working with a vendor that does that, I'd encourage you as a content team just kind of like map out what are the different types of content that we have and how should they be related to each other. And is that how we're, how we're kind of like structuring them now, et cetera. So I think that can be sort of like helpful because you're thinking a lot about content in maybe more of an abstract or schematic way, as opposed to just like, as opposed to like living in a specific location on a specific page. From that, so that's from the content side. From the developer side, what we often see is that, and there's a number of things, but often there's a skill transition towards more of a JavaScript oriented world, Node.js, React, Gatsby. So folks, and so sometimes that's like bringing in new folks to the team. Sometimes, existing folks are excited to learn sort of like new technologies. And sometimes it's just like a new generation and a new wave where like, older, where like, your engineering team might be folks who all sort of grew up in the JavaScript world. And there's a little bit of a generational thing there. So but it's a really good question because there are, and I could probably talk about this one for, a while, so I won't. But there are like a lot of definitely distinct pieces of the puzzle depending on where you sit in New York.
Awesome. We have another question here from Jose. Based on the architecture provided, is it cloud agnostic or is there any focus on providers?
I try not to focus on providers too much because I want to focus more on sort of the category of tools. And you'll see that with the examples and the case studies, obviously, in the case studies, you'll see, oh, well, uh, when Little Caesars decided to go with this, here's what these for, these Gatsby, and here's how they kind of set Gatsby up, and et cetera. Or you'll see with Cabrillo College, well, they went with WordPress with, headless WordPress with Gatsby. And so you'll see the examples in the case studies, but I try to talk more on a category level, just to kind of keep it like agnostic. I talk about, just to keep it agnostic, because people use a lot of different solutions for each of the different pieces of the puzzle.
But if for anyone listening, please use Gatsby. That's the right answer, Sam.
Thank you, Neha.
Just joking. So in terms of case studies, you mentioned case studies in this book. Honestly, I love this area of the book just because, probably because I'm a marketer, but I love that we dive into how organizations of all sizes have used Gatsby, not just like the Little Caesars of the world. We have High Res Studio, we have wavedirect.net. There's so many great nuggets in here, Sam. So thank you for like really humanizing this book, I would say, and making it relatable and something that people actually would want to read. So that's amazing. So we have another great question here from Butchan. What is the prereq in terms of learning experience required to gain excellent knowledge from your book?
None really. I'll asterisk that in that the book is written for people who sort of like work on websites. But like whether that's marketers, whether that, content folks, demand gen folks, developers, designers, and engineering managers, tech leads, agency owners, clients, project and product managers, et cetera. I think like it's really for all folks that are work with websites. And we've seen sort of like a few folks that we've given kind of like early copies to of the book, that it's kind of spurred these conversations between different functions inside the organization.
Love it. Okay, we have another great question from Lori. When should one use Gatsby as opposed to a static site generator?
It's funny because Gatsby sort of started off as a static site generator, and now we like to call ourselves more of like a reactive site generator. And what that means is that when a content update sort of gets pushed in the CMS, if you're using Gatsby and Gatsby Cloud, it'll go live on the website sort of often in under 5 seconds. And so my co-founder, Kyle Matthews, had a great blog post about this a while ago. What I'd say is that like we really recommend Gatsby for content heavy sites, anything with a headless CMS or e-commerce. Like we recommend that. If you want to build like a SaaS application, I mean, you could use Gatsby for that if you want, but it's like maybe not the best suited tool. You should maybe think about using something else. But for content driven websites, especially backed by a headless CMS, Gatsby is the best choice.
Love it. And it seems like we have quite a few questions, and I'm just gonna basically summarize all of those into one. But it's, Jerome asked this, Sajith asked this, but essentially, is Gatsby similar to Next.js, and why should one use Gatsby over Next.js?
Yeah, and I think that's we specifically kind of like built Gatsby around kind of like the content, the content use case, and so there's a lot of workflows around whether that's like fetching data, or Gatsby comes with the sort of out of the box integrations with Contentful, Content Stack, Sanity, WordPress, Drupal, et cetera, et cetera. It's a lot easier to like get to bring data into Gatsby from if you're using a headless CMS. It's also easier from like a content workflow perspective because content editors need to being able to preview and publish their changes kind of very quickly. We've sort of like designed we've designed Gatsby and Gatsby Cloud so that it sort of creates that feature automatically within your headless CMS, as opposed to having to set it up manually and such. So Gatsby is, if it's a content-driven website, large content-driven website, a small content-driven website, any size of content-driven website, backed by a headless CMS, you should definitely use Gatsby.
Yeah, and if you want your marketers to be happy within your organization, use Gatsby.
Yeah.
Sweet. So we have a few more questions. Again, folks, if you have anything that you want to ask, feel free to, type it in. I'll make sure we have Sam here with us today so he can answer them live. But we have a couple more trickling in. Hi, Sam. I want to ask you, if you had to build an e-commerce, are you going to choose Gatsby if you've already perfected Next.js? How is Gatsby going to boost performance compared to Next.js?
Yeah. Yeah, the answer yes. I mean, I think there's not much of a learning curve. If you're familiar with Next, there's not much of a learning curve to Gatsby. But we've kind of optimized. There's a lot of sort of like performance details that we've optimized, and I won't go into it for a long time, but I will say that like I wrote a blog post a couple of weeks ago that sort of did a comprehensive analysis of HTTP archive data across a bunch of different metrics, whether it was like LCP or FCP or TTI or 85% visual complete, or which is there's a lot of like stages along the page load. And basically, Gatsby was consistently like 30-40% faster. And the average Gatsby site was 30 to 40% faster to load than the average Next site. This is across tens of thousands of sites in the HTTP archive data set, which is kind of the most comprehensive data set. But there's just a lot of sort of like just a number of small optimizations. I see a question from Ilesh in the Q&A, which is, so I'll sort of read that and then I can, I'll go ahead and answer it, which is, what's your view over the term composable and composability compared to modular architecture? Is it the same? Yes, it's the same thing. It's funny how we all have sort of different words of describing the same thing. So composable, modular, headless. I actually like to claim some amount of personal credit, because back in 2018, I wrote a sort of a blog series talking about the content mesh, which I think was, so maybe that wasn't the term that sort of caught on, but it was the concepts of that. That have caught on, and I think that sort of show up here as well. And the reason that I use the word modular specifically is that I'm an engineer, and like, to me, when I hear modular describes what it is, and it's, I think composable describes what you can do with it. But I'm an engineer, so I'm, I use the word that's sort of like, okay, what is it? It's a modular architecture. It's stackable, So some of that's maybe just personal preference, but I do think that like us having this kind of common vocabulary is very useful for broad adoption of the trend.
Awesome. Thanks for answering that, Sam. We have another question here from Victor. What CMS works great with Gatsby?
So we have. I will also drop a link in the chat for our docs page around that, and then I'll also answer. I will also answer live. So there's about 9 different CMSs that have first-class integrations with Gatsby, which I dropped in the link into the chat here, which are Contentful, Content Stack, WordPress, Drupal, Prismic, Sanity, Strapi, and then there's e-commerce platforms as well, so Shopify, and then there's a variety of other ones we see folks using as well, Storyblock and Kentico, or Content.ai, I think they've renamed themselves, so there's a wide variety of like popular headless CMSs that folks are using.
Love it. We have a great question here from Jerome. Sam, why should I not use Gatsby?
Why should you not use Gatsby? I think I think there are projects that are less well suited for Gatsby, like a SaaS application. In that case, again, you could use Gatsby in that case, but you may want to use a headless CMS kind of instead. You may want to use a different framework instead that's more well suited for like a SaaS application. I think one thing that we may have that I think would be useful to sort of like just talk a little bit about in terms of the book specifically is there's a transition here from the sort of the older monolithic architecture to sort of a newer modular architecture. And I think a lot of times there's a lot of like lore in here, if that word makes sense to folks, which is like the story of like how a lot of these solutions kind of came to be and emerged, whether that's like how did demand generation it kind of get sort of created as a discipline, how did like payments providers sort of happen, and how did e-commerce and like Shopify sort of evolve, and I think like we're now using these tools because we hear about Shopify or we hear about Contentful, and I think it's useful to kind of, and I think one of the useful things about and some of this I was like learning into and diving into as I was kind of like doing some research for this book is what caused these tools to exist and what was the problem that they were like solving at the time, and like I think that helps us understand. And so like I've covered a lot of the evolution of that, of like the mobile sort of like mobile web ecosystem, mobile performance, demand generation, a lot of the emergence of like these different categories of tools from search and auth tools, Auth Zero, like headless CMS, payments, Stripe, Shopify, the whole Shopify sort of ecosystem, and the burgeoning kind of like different pieces of that e-commerce piece. But I think sometimes we're very practical people as like developers, as marketers, as folks that sort of work in organizations building websites day to day. And sometimes it can, one of the things I wanted to do here too is like just let us take a little bit of a step back and say, well, where did all these tools come from? What problems are they trying to solve? And how does that help me understand how to use them now, sort of in collaboration with each other?
Love that. We have another great question here from Hayden. What's your preferred CMS option to use with Gatsby that just works really well in terms of developer and content user experience?
Yeah, well, what I'll say is that the most popular CMS to use with Gatsby is Contentful. So we'd say about like 50% of folks using Gatsby use Contentful. So if you're looking for sort of like a default choice, Contentful is a great option there. It is a great option there, and I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and Sasha, their co-founder and chief strategy officer, actually wrote the foreword for Sam's book. So be sure to dig into that. We have another question. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, yeah, and it was actually that. Thanks for thanks for reminding me of that Neha. Yeah, it was really actually very, very generous of Sasha. So, this is something Sasha, Kyle and I have known Sasha for several years. So Sasha and Paolo founded Contentful back in 2013, and back then they were sort of like nobody really got, why would you need an API based CMS? Why don't you just use WordPress? By 2017, like more folks were kind of starting to get it, but and then there's just been a tremendous amount of movement in terms of what people are building with like Gatsby and Contentful or other headless CMSs since then, from sort of smaller company websites to commerce brands doing millions and millions of dollars to some of the largest companies in the world, Johnson & Johnson and Roche and Nestle and other sort of like very large companies using these solutions together. But like Sasha wrote a very kind of generous and like very kind intro, and he kind of called it the missing guide to the modular, or the missing guide to the modern web, which I thought was like an just incredibly like kind way of and like descriptive way of putting this, because with all these different tools, it's just like we've all seen this, but how do we describe how they work together for everybody's benefit?
Love it. Well, I'm excited for people to get their hands on their book and read the forward by Sasha as well. Okay, looks like we have more questions coming in, which is amazing. So Jeffrey's asking, are there any good visual website builders that people use with Gatsby, like Webflow, Elementor, anything like that?
We see there's some, not typically. We do see some people. There's Webflow does have like there's a library that like lets Webflow that exports Webflow sites to Gatsby. So sometimes, once in a while, we'll see that someone's built a site in Gatsby in Webflow and exported it to Gatsby. But then that also makes it very hard to edit afterwards. So that's not very common, I'd say.
Cool. Sai is asking, I'm curious about your opinions on more recent tools like Astro.js and others with similar patterns.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's really exciting to watch kind of like what sort of like frameworks like Remix or Astro are coming out and doing. I think there's a couple of interesting things that these frameworks that one thing that like these frameworks are focusing on that have sort of inspired some changes in Gatsby as well is just really focusing on very short sort of like build times, focusing on less JavaScript. You know, some of them are kind of going framework agnostic, which is like interesting, and we'll kind of see how that plays out. I don't have an opinion right now, but you know, maybe I will in 6 months. I guess we'll see. But it's, I mean, I think what they show is the amount of vibrancy in the JavaScript world and the JavaScript community, and I think what is likely to happen is that, you know, each of these frameworks is going to be really good for something, for a particular use case. And so you know, Gatsby is really great for like content driven websites backed by headless CMS. And then I think but it took us a while to sort of like figure out that was like the thing that Gatsby was the best for. And so I think, you know, eventually I think people will figure out, well, this is the thing that Astro is the best for, and this is the thing that like Remix is the best for. And I think that'll happen over time.
Love it. Okay, last couple of questions, and I know we're kind of closing in on time here, but I wanted to get these to you, Sam. So Lori's asking, would you recommend Gatsby for a content-driven website that is all developer managed and no CMS?
I guess I would have to know a little bit more, but I would say so. And the reason I would say so is actually like, you know, I find that so I mean, I would probably have to know more. I mean, Gatsby does work great with Markdown. So if the content is all in Markdown, then that's totally fine. You know, but I think it also, what I'm hearing is that if there's no CMS, I'd still recommend Gatsby, but the framework choice probably matters a little bit less if that is the case.
Love it. Let's see, what else is there? There's quite a few more questions. Okay, but let's jump into a couple more. So Sajith is asking, can I do server-side rendering using Gatsby?
Yes. So with Gatsby 4, which was about a year ago, we added the capability of doing server-side rendering, as well as serverless functions and what we call deferred site generation. There's a guide to server-side rendering in the docs, so you can go through the Gatsby docs and find find out how to do it there.
Love it. Oh, I love this question from John. So John is asking, this is all good in a captive dev audience, though to translate this to clients that need a site built, how can a client understand what all is possible, especially to where a modular approach will be implemented?
Yeah. So I think this is probably a great question to end on. So the answer is like, read this book, and I'd say share it with folks, because share it with your clients. We've seen folks give it to clients. We've seen, because ultimately, a lot of these technologies we are more familiar with as developers, but again, websites are one of the most cross-functional projects in any organization, and so if it's not that it's not that marketers if a marketer or a client doesn't understand how the architecture works, it's probably just that they haven't read a good explanation yet, because they read different things than we do as developers, right? So like please, if your clients are not sure how, are confused or not sure about the new stack, please just give them a copy, and then, like, you know, talk about it later, and I think they'll see how the whole thing works together.
Awesome. And I just put in, oh, I'm just about to actually. I'm going to put in the link again for everyone to fill out if you haven't already, to get a free copy of Sam's book that will be mailing out. So make sure you do so. And I guess on that note, thank you everyone for joining us. We had a super engaging conversation. So thank you for asking those hard questions. We're hoping everything that we didn't get a chance to get to today, you're going to find the answers to in this book. So thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, we'll catch you next time. And Sam, congrats again. This is a major, major feat, and you should be very proud.
Thanks. And thanks everybody for coming. It's great to see you. It's great to hear everybody's questions, and look forward to everyone getting a copy of their books and reading it and sharing it with others in the organization. So thanks for coming, and have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, take care. And one more thing I will add, if you do get a copy of your book, share it on Twitter, share it on LinkedIn, tag us, tag Sam. And we'd love to retweet and kind of spread the love and help out Sam with his book launch. So thanks again, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.